Okay. Can anybody hear me? We're having a lot of trouble right now, and I wonder if people can hear me. If you can figure out how to raise your hand, that would be exciting to me. People are raising their hands. Oh, yes. Thank you, Lord, of technology. Okay, we've, woo, wow. This beginning process was very difficult. And I really appreciate people hanging in. That was a full 10 minutes of technical difficulties, and now we're behind. I am just going to have to host until I can hear from Skye. So thank you so much for joining us for webinar 10, Budgeting for Accessibility. As I was saying before, this webinar is about a lot more than just money. And initially, the slide had like a picture of a budget on it, and it made me quite depressed, actually, because in our field, there isn't a lot of money. And I think that thinking about money depresses me personally and professionally sometimes. But I get really, really excited about talking about different ways we can open up a little bit more to increase social inclusion and accessibility in our work. And so this is your agenda for the day. We did a lot on technical difficulties. What I want to do is tell you, Skye, are you there? And can you hear? And can you host? All right. We have several options for accessibility in our webinar today. I think one of the main things that I would like you to notice in your dashboard is the fact that we have handouts. In order for you to benefit from the live stream, let me give you the, now my slides won't change.
Yeah, you have to be in PowerPoint to get them to change.
There it is. Okay. In order for you to see the live captioning, you need to open a new browser and put in that URL. And you need to have all of the windows open at the same time. So for your convenience, in the dashboard, we have uploaded the slides, the slide deck. So if you do need live captioning, you can read the words as they're happening and follow along with the slides. I'm going to skip over a lot more of what I would say there. I want you to know that there's so much to learn about accessibility, and in 70 minutes, I couldn't teach you all of what I've learned in the last, I've been working and collaborating with disability services for a little over 10 years now, but it hasn't been until really the last 3 years that I have intensively and intentionally expanded beyond working with organizations into working with human beings and paying them for their time. And I want to talk with you about that today. So I'm Cierra, and I have been doing primary prevention since about 2005. I have been a victims advocate since 1998, and I am a bit rusty on my direct service because when I was hired here in 2015, I had a privilege, I really think it is a privilege, to focus only on primary prevention, and I had the opportunity to leave some forms of advocacy behind. So the first thing that I want to do is really address some of the feedback that we have been getting from our participants over the last 4 webinars. which is that people are really wanting a more specific connection to sexual violence primary prevention, and how the content in the webinar is directly related to that. And so I'm going to start us off with a little grounding. So first, I feel like I don't have time for this, but I feel like it's really important. So, and I need this. So I have a little frazzle moment in the beginning, and what I want to do is ask everybody to pay attention to where you are connected with the earth or the ground or your chair right now. Just take a moment and feel your feet. Grounding is so important. It's so important for so many reasons. Grounding in sexual violence primary prevention will help you to understand why we talk about the things that we talk about. But being grounded also helps in so many ways, spiritually and emotionally, and with my disability. I am a person with a disability. I have mental health disabilities. Anyway, okay, I'm getting off track. So I'm showing you a picture that sort of reminds me of where we are as a field, as sexual violence primary preventionists. I see in this picture beginnings and endings. So I chose oak leaves and acorns because in my tribe and culture, these things are very, very important. Our grandmother oak oversees the land on our ancestral tribal lands, and she fed us and she provided medicine for us. And so what I see here is a very, I see endings and beginnings, and I see these things happening on fertile ground. And I actually think that's where our sexual violence primary prevention movement is right now. I'm seeing an explosion of ideas in intimate partner violence primary prevention that I really am not seeing a lot of in sexual violence primary prevention. For example, if you just look at the time and attention that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention puts into intimate partner violence, there are about 3 technical packages now since 2016, whereas sexual violence primary prevention still only has the Stop SV technical package. And so there's not a lot of research, there's not a lot out there. So we have a long way to go, and we have come so far. And so that's what I feel like this picture really represents. And furthermore, primary prevention is really about what goes on around us. It shapes us. So sexual violence primary prevention is about trying to make sexual violence less easy and desirable to commit. It's trying to make sexual violence less of an option that somebody would want to choose. Like, why would somebody be motivated to sexually harm someone? We need to address that. And in order to do that, we need to make it less easy to achieve. And that's really what sexual violence primary prevention is about. And we use the public health approach to look at ways in which we can impact the environment, focusing on things that increase the risk for injury or decrease the risk for injury. And so sexual violence uses the public health approach. And I also think that where we are now was really shaped by early white feminisms. And so there we have a long way to go as well. I'm going to get into that in a little bit if I still have time. So to stop sexual violence, we need to address social norms. We need to increase skills to prevent sexual violence. We need to provide opportunities to empower girls and young women, and we need to support survivors to lessen harms. Those are the things that are spelled out in the Stop SV technical package. Well, most of my work over the last 5 years has been trying to address and increase social inclusion. because the Connecting the Dots technical package taught us that community support and connectedness is one of the only shared protective factors that protect against sexual violence, and they protect against myriad other things. But the reason why connectedness is so important for people with disabilities is when you think about connectedness, we think about things like transportation and employment and food access and food security and accessible neighborhoods and accessible community gardens and inclusive classrooms that don't separate the children when it's time to talk about sexual and relationship health, and a vision where people with disabilities are in charge and leading the change. And so really, the more people, the more agencies, and the more resources and opportunities that you are connected to, the far more protected you are against sexual violence. And what I want to ask everybody is, do you have the lens to see the things that are made invisible by the privileges that you own, that you have, by the things that are advantageous to you? How many of you notice how many ramps there are to houses in your neighborhood, or how many of you notice the conditions of sidewalks, or whether there are sidewalks and whether there are curb cuts in those sidewalks? Those things are taken for granted, and it is those things that allow access to social inclusion. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying about the public health approach being insufficient for the social change that we need for sexual violence primary prevention, and the white feminisms that fed into that professionalization. And I'm not dissing feminism. I could diss some feminisms if I'm honest, but feminism is really, really pivotal to a power analysis. And thank goodness for that. Okay, now I've gone down a rabbit hole. The point that I want to make to you is that sexual violence doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it is distinct from other kinds of relationship violence, but public health alone is insufficient to address power differentials. And early feminisms are also insufficient to address power differentials, even though the power analysis was developed there. It's a very interesting tension there. So what I wanted to say is, like, the social determinants of health, those things, wow, that was, I'm sorry. The social determinants of health get us a little bit closer to addressing equity, but it defangs oppression by calling it disparities, health disparities. And so this is where I think that the disability justice field and frameworks can help us. So what I want to say is that accessibility is just a legal bare minimum. Accessibility is about covering an organization or corporation's behind and bottom line. And so accessibility left alone, as it is in the Americans with Disability Act, and thank goodness we have it, but left alone, it is insufficient for social inclusion. So accessibility is not the same as social inclusion. Accessibility is about rights, like a legal base minimum rights to be able to have access to places and things. Whereas social inclusion is an immersive practice, and it's a process, and it's active. So disability justice brings the people in. Disability justice brings bodies in. This is something that's really kind of absent with the professionalization, is when we professionalize things, it's like we don't have bodies. Like, you don't have bodies, you're never uncomfortable, you know, all of these things, like everybody can hear the same, everybody can see the same. None of those things are true. And so that's something that we can take from the disability justice framework is bodies are always there, period, full stop, and bodies have needs. And so the disability justice field also gives us a solution focus, and I know the public health approach is about that as well. But what I mean by this is intentionally intersectional practices are necessary to get us to social inclusion. We have to address power and oppression and move beyond rights, or else we end up with the status quo, or else the result of not intentionally being inclusive is that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are among the most socially isolated human beings on the planet. And this is a structural and social isolation. And the consequences are huge. Social isolation is a risk factor for 6 different forms of violence, and you will see that child maltreatment, teen dating violence, youth violence, bullying, partner violence, elder abuse, and suicide are not sexual violence, but sexual violence can occur when somebody is socially isolated. So I don't have a lot of time to go into this picture with you, but this is a picture of the average social network of a person with a physical disability. So what you're looking at is the 2 greatest aspects of support in this person's life comes from their peers and from paid caregivers. So if we are looking at people with intellectual disabilities and thinking about sexual violence primary prevention and looking at this as sort of a baseline for what somebody's social network would look like, the friends, just peers of any kind, is the category with the least amount of humans in it. And then family is another, smaller category. What is my point? I'm trying to say that caregivers don't get paid enough to be as safe as they should. Shoot, I'm not putting that correctly. So direct support providers are among the poorest humans in America. They don't get paid enough, and many people have to work more than 100 hours a week to get by on that wage. And what happens is people get angry, people get burnt out on the job, people become terse, people who are caregivers can wipe somebody too hard when they're irritated, and there you have sexual violence. People with intellectual disabilities peers are among those who are never taught about their bodies and about sexuality and about healthy relationships and public and private and things like that. And so we have this this environment is ripe for sexual violence. And so I'm hoping that those ideas provided you with a little bit of grounding about sexual violence prevention. I stayed on this topic a lot longer than I meant to. I am going to now ask us to fill out a poll. I want to ask a question. Skye, are you there? I'm wondering if you can run the poll, and I can't hear you.
I don't think Skye can hear.
All right, I'm just gonna. So I'm not sure what's happening. I just want to tell everybody who has questions that aren't being addressed, I cannot do this presentation and do the technology, and I am so sorry. I'm so sorry. Okay, so the poll, this poll is really important to me, so I'm going to ask you to please take this poll. I'm asking people, do you have one or more budget line items dedicated to accessibility in your current programs or projects. And I am getting in some responses. I'm going to keep talking a little bit. It looks like we have about 30% of people have participated. Okay, so now we're over 50% participation. I really appreciate you paying attention to this and selecting your option. It looks like we are exactly 50-50. Let's see, close. Can I share? Wow, okay. We are exactly 50-50. 61% of us voted. And so I actually was expecting to see a lot less. And this is very exciting to see that so many people include budgeting in their line items. And that's wonderful. Let me see if I can ask you to do one more poll. What I want to ask you about this time is whether or not you have an accessibility statement prominently displayed in your communications or events. And I realize that's an imperfect evaluation question because I'm asking you about two different things, communications and events. So that's why I separated out the answers. So your choices for this poll is, yes, we include an accessibility statement in some or all. Yes, communications. Yes, for some or all events. Yes, for our website. That was just a little sneaky. I forgot to ask about that in the question, my bad. And then no. So it looks like we've only had about 30% of the audience voting here. And it looks like about 20% is yes for communications, 20% is yes for events, and about 20% for websites, and that's really good. Section 508 just came out, and everybody is now required under the ADA to have an accessible website, and I will give you resources for that. Thank you for participating in the poll. Here are our results. So we had we have a lot of people who do some of these things. And so it is my hope that after this, you will be doing more of those things after this webinar. Thank you so much for doing that with me. And so now I want to talk to you about the whole meat of everything that we want to talk about today, which is what is in your budget. And I am going to be talking about things like time, space, money, and representation. I'm trying to see where I am with time. Okay. Awesome. Okay, so the thing that I wanted to share with you on this slide is that becoming more accessible and using sexual violence primary prevention strategies that address social inclusion are deliberate and time consuming. And so given that, I just want to connect sexual violence to accessibility in one pretty obvious way right now, which is, I mean, what does accessibility have to do with sexual violence primary prevention? Well, we receive funding from the CDC, has the Rape Prevention and Education Grant that they disseminate to all states, and each state has their own way of implementing that. In the state of Indiana, it is a competitive process, and all the coalitions that apply for it are in competition against each other, and the coalitions are competing for the same funding against local programs. And we have received funding for this project. So that's one of the direct connections to budgeting and sexual violence prevention. And now I want to talk to you about budgeting time. I want to tell you about the things that I've learned. The Skye and I have learned a lot over these last couple of years collaborating with different people and different organizations. And so what I want to talk to you about in terms of time is relationships and communication and translation time. I'm going to talk to you about preparation time, and I'm going to talk to you about event time. So in terms of communication, it takes a lot of time to build trust with other agencies to do sexual violence primary prevention, because we have to leave our silos of violence prevention and intervention and go into a different field. It takes a lot of time to build up the trust to allow for a sharing of the turf, essentially. And so you sometimes have to wait for what you need. You might want to collaborate with X agency, but they don't know you and don't know who you are. And so you have to build a relationship with them. One of the, about communication, so Skye and I have a wonderful collaborator whose name is Jody Powers, and you've met her before if you have caught any of our previous webinars. She is a co-organizer with us, and she has done some presentations, and she has cerebral palsy. And for 20 minutes for me to communicate with you takes 20 minutes, but 20 minutes of content for Jody to communicate with you takes about 40 or 50 minutes of content. And I think one very beautiful example of this happening organically is webinar number 8, when Skye, Jody, and I were talking about accessible organizing. All of us knew that it takes time. It takes time to communicate with Jody because there's a translation process. Not everyone can understand Jody's speech impediment. And the more time that you spend, the more time that I have spent with Jody, the faster my brain has become in understanding her speech patterns. And that has been really helpful. So when you're planning webinars or speaking engagements or whatever, paying attention to the pacing of someone's speech is really important, and then allowing for that. And so those are some of the things. I also wanted to address time, and this is related to funding, but so just Jody has been doing some consulting for ICADV where I work, and we pay Jody $30 an hour for her time. And Jody has expressed to us on multiple occasions how uncomfortable she is with being compensated at the same rate as a person without, I just said speech impediment, but what I meant was also less dexterity. So typing takes longer is what I'm trying to say. And so Jody is comparing her productivity to my productivity and feeling awful about it. And so we remind our consultants, the consultants with ADD, the consultants with ADHD, consultants with dyslexia, consultants with other forms of communication. Like I used to work with Michael Ely, and for us to have what would be like a 2-minute conversation took about 25 minutes because he had to type everything and he had low dexterity. I don't know any other way to say that. So it just took longer, and you have to be patient when you're giving this time. It's hard to know what to do with your body when the person that you're speaking with is typing their response, because my disability makes me want to fill the time with prattle because I'm so nervous. But okay, so we pay for time. We're not going to do sub minimum wages. That is just not, we don't on the Abuse Prevention Disability Task Force, you get paid the same rate as all of the consultants, and that's $30 an hour. So the prep time. Accessible PowerPoints are so hard. They're so hard, and you need to give yourself weeks ahead of time to get your PowerPoint done. So my recommendation with this accessible PowerPoints is to find one in Word that is already accessible. I don't want to, there are so many details, but essentially the PowerPoint has layers, and every layer will be read with a reader. So for people who are blind, their reader will read all the things, and with an accessible PowerPoint, it's going to direct the reader not to say, this is a text box, and in this text box there are these words. You want the reader to just say what is on the PowerPoint that is relevant for your viewer to know, and that takes so much time. Another thing is that the CART translators, the real-time translators, need your materials at least a week ahead of time, because it's easier for the provider to write things accurately when they can see what the content will be, especially if it is jargon heavy. Having the person have access to special words or special spellings is really important. Also, I just want to say shout out to you, Francisco. Thank you for doing CART. Another thing in terms of preparation time is travel time. Accessible travel is expensive and time consuming. I am going to try to come back to this. In terms of event time, something that I have learned and experienced very recently with the Governor's Council for People with Disabilities Conference is a starting time after 9:30 a.m. Can you believe it? The conference on one of the days started at 10 a.m. and it was so glorious. And it ended at like 4:30. So when you're thinking about budgeting time, because bodies are a thing and everybody has needs, starting later is, if you want people with disabilities, especially people with multiple kinds of disabilities, I think in medical field it's called comorbidity. Kat, is my water over there perchance? No, it's right here. Sorry, everybody. Where was I? Comorbidity. It takes a lot of time to get ready in the morning. And with people who have home-based services, a lot of things need to happen in the morning in order for that person to even be prepared to go to the event. And when we make our start times at 8 a.m., it's going to take, so our participant will have to rearrange everything. And the chances of them not getting the home health services that they need so that they can come to our thing are really high. And so when we have a start time at like 8 or 8:30, we are impacting so much in a person with a disability's life that it's just so much easier to try to start at 10 so that people can get ready in the morning. It's the ethical thing to do. Bio breaks are another thing that I feel like we skimp on. We're like, oh, it takes 5 minutes to go to the bathroom. Well, I mean, for some people it does, but for some people need to transfer from a power chair to the toilet. Some people do that. Oh, you taught me a new word about mobility, like ambulatory. Should I?
Some wheelchair users are ambulatory wheelchair users, which means they can walk a short distance. They can get out of the chair, walk into a stall, use the restroom, walk back out of the stall. Some of them are not ambulatory, which means they need to transfer directly from the chair to the toilet. So there are actually two different kinds of accessible stalls that are allowed through the ADA. You have to have one of the larger ones, but if you have a certain number of stalls, you can have one of the smaller ones as well. But it does take time, and especially if you have multiple people with disabilities, you're going to have a line for that stall, and not everyone respects that that stall should be reserved for people who use wheelchairs or for people who require an accessible stall. So budgeting, instead of 5 minutes, budgeting 15 minutes or even 20 minutes in like a passing period to do it like high school style is much kinder.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes. So the Governor's Council for People with Disabilities had a 30-minute passing time, and I had a blast. It was so good, great for networking and making friends. And all of those things lead to more space, more friends, more networks. Speaking of space, this next part might be a little weird for you because I need to use my body to make a point, and it is kind of weird, but the point that I want to make is the ADA standard, which is supposed to give you enough space, like literally enough space, feet, inches. It just doesn't always work for people. Bodies are not standard often. And so I'm going to use myself to demonstrate, and I'm going to take you to the bathroom with me right now. So here we go. All right. So I wanted to talk to you about why me, an ambulatory person, would use the accessible stall. Okay, so welcome to my panic room. I have a anxiety disorder that can be disabling. And one of the best places for me is the accessible stall. This slide is showing you how difficult it is for me to get into a regular size bathroom. So what you're looking at on the left is basically I have to get behind the toilet to be able to close the door, and then my body touches the walls. So the picture on the right is me in my Wall Street girl power stance. And, you know, this is one of the things I use my panic room for, is getting in the moment and, like, you know, getting empowered. And I can't even stand like that in this stall. You know, I can't get clean in this stall, to be perfectly honest with you. This stall is inaccessible for me. And so because I am a person with invisible disabilities, I often feel really, really guilty when I do use the accessible stall. And in putting together this PowerPoint, I let go of that guilt because I just realized the other one is inaccessible for me. My body doesn't fit in it. So this stall, the one that Kat's called the big one, the one there with me standing with my arms wide out, this is my panic room. This is where I go before I have speaking engagements and do my power stance and talk myself up. And this stall would actually be accessible for anybody using a power chair or a manual wheelchair. And the building across the way, so this is in our building where I work. I spend a lot of time there in that room. The one across the street where we have all of our events, at one of the events last summer, I realized that my colleague who uses a power chair could not use the accessible stall in that building. So that's me standing in front of there. So what my colleague has to do is park her chair in front of that stall that's right next to the accessible stall. And then she has to get out and transfer in public. And this also requires, so the door has to stay open. And so essentially your body parts and your business are on display in order to just do your business. And so what we have done, because there are so many reasons why fixing this by building something can't happen right now. We purchased 2 screens. They were $75, and we are going to use them anytime we need to do events in this building. We're going to put the screens, so where I'm standing and where there's a mirror, there will be a screen so people who are behind that point can't see, and then there will be one on the side. So at least the transferring and the pulling up of the pants and doing the business can't be visible. But this is what I was talking about. The things that are like invisible to you if you don't have to pay attention to it are things that can cause harm to others. And so when we are, let's see, I'm going to do a time check. I am so behind. Okay. I'm going to move to my budget because I feel like this is so very important, and one of the things that I think would be helpful as somebody who might be new to thinking about money and budgeting. So what you have in front of you, and again, we've included these in handouts, is a mock budget. So this is actually a snapshot of Skye and my budget for our rape prevention, education, sexual violence, primary prevention strategies that we use with the Abuse Prevention Disability Task Force. Wow, that was a mouthful. So what you can see here is that, so look at the travel real quick. You'll see $560 per trip for 3 trips. That is how much money it costs for me to be in the same room with my colleague, Jody Powers, who lives in Muncie. Now, if she were to take an Uber, if that was even possible, we would be able to budget $150 for this, back and forth. $560 is back and forth. So we get charged per mileage. The company, there's only one company in the state of Indiana that will go anywhere. And so we get charged extra because they have to leave before their working day starts. So we pay time and a half. And then they're working past when their workday ends, because that's when our events end. And so we have to pay time and a half again just for Jody to have a ride. And what you're looking at is a 300% or more increase between travel that is inaccessible and travel that is accessible. And so that, you know, the consequences of this are I get to see my colleague less, and I can't tell you all of the benefits that I get from being in the same room with her. It's pivotal to our work. Okay, so then we budget mileage. That's, I feel like a lot of people do that. One of the things that I think that makes us interesting and different is that every single person who does not get compensated for their time on this task force gets a stipend for every meeting. We pay $30 for every meeting. We pay $30 for every hour that somebody works for us. It's called consulting. So you can see that we have a consulting line item of $3,810. So I want to tell you that I recognize that this is the budget of a coalition level work. This would be difficult, if not impossible, to achieve for a local program. And that is why Kat is here, because she's going to tell us all about how that's one of the reasons why Kat is here. She's going to tell us all about how we can find funding to do that. But this kind of budgeting here, this is coalition level, this is State Department of Health level, this is Department of Justice level, this is, we have somebody from the Attorney General's office on the line today. This is that level of funding. And this is actually not a lot of funding. And, you know, if I had my wish, it would be a lot more. But so I just want you to feel like if you are in a local program and you're looking at this and you're like, whatever, that's like impossible, pipe dreams, it's not totally impossible, and I feel you. And so that's why I'm asking people who are at that leadership level who grant funding to create an accessibility statement to put in your RFPs and RFAs, but also do a mock budget like this so that people can see what accessible budgeting looks like. It's so important for us. Like, that's part of how social change comes. ICADV is a subgrantor, and now we are doing this so that the people who receive funds can see that we prioritize accessibility, and we expect to see something around accessibility in the budgets that they send to us for funding. So that's one way that we can have an impact. And I believe that it was right around this time that I wanted to transition to Kat, because she needs more time. So just with this transition, this slide will help you get some inroads to where you can start with this. I also gave you a handout about what I did here, about how I made the pitch to include accessibility in our budgeting. And I even created a accessibility statement for you to use if you like. So Vera Institute of Justice is so great in terms of the tips and tricks that they have. So I gave you that link, and now I am just talking. So I'm gonna hand it over to Kat, and Kat, your intro slide is in there. Okay, fabulous. Thank you. Oh my gosh, the thing just went.
Hello, I am Kat, and I'm going to talk about where to get funding for accessibility for events. So my name is Kat Chappell. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am the Outreach and Operations Manager for the Indiana Governor's Council for People with Disabilities. I've been there since May of 2018. Before that, I worked at a day program called Outside the Box that worked with people with developmental and intellectual disabilities. I'm a person with a mental illness and an invisible disability. I am queer, and my background is cultural anthropology, museum studies, and education. So what is GCPD? We are the Indiana Governor's Council for People with Disabilities. We are the state DD council. Every state has a developmental disabilities council, including yours, per federal statute. So what is GCPD? We're an organization whose mission is to advance the independence, productivity, and inclusion of people with disabilities in all aspects of society. So we do this in a few different ways. We have advocacy programs, awareness initiatives, and funding programs to assist people with disabilities in becoming the advocates and representatives that they want and deserve to be. So ultimately, we're buying the megaphones to make sure that the people who want to be heard are heard. We don't want to speak for anyone. Instead, what we want to do is take people who want to be advocates and who want to be more involved in political processes, in decision making, in whatever aspect of society, in employment, in health and wellness, in whatever. We want to enable them to do that. So what kind of funding does the council offer? And this is specific to the Indiana Governor's Council, but every DD council has certain initiatives that they fund. So we fund program initiatives that are long-term, 3 to 5 year funding. So we have Back Home Indiana, which is something that it's a program that lets people who are in nursing homes or who are in group homes get budget and get money to move into their own home. The Indiana Disability History Project, which is fairly self-explanatory, and we're currently working with IU for a sexual health literacy for women with disabilities. We also have the Consumer Education Fund. It's a reimbursement-based micro grant that lets individuals attend workshops or conferences related to their disabilities. That's for people with disabilities or their families. The CEF has 3 branches: the individual, the organizational, and transition fairs. So the Individual Consumer Education Fund is for people with disabilities or their family members. It is up to $1,500 per individual or $3,000 per household every 2 years. And it's for people with disabilities or their families to attend conferences, conventions, or workshops to learn more about their disability or advocacy in the disability community. And the amount funded is based on need and benefits received. So for example, if the person receives SSI, there's one level of funding. SSDI, SNAP, or TANF, there's another level of funding. And if they receive no benefits, they're still able to go. It's just a different level. So this lets people with disabilities and their families access the information and educational events, which will enable them to participate effectively in the decision-making process by being involved with public agencies, service providers, and consumer advocacy groups. The Organizational Consumer Education Fund. This is the one that actually will apply to ICADV, to ICESA, to other organizations who are looking to include people with disabilities in their event. So organizations can request funds for registration for people who would qualify for CEF, so for people with disabilities or their family members, lodging accommodations for those same consumers, child or respite or attendant care. So Cierra mentioned that there are direct service providers. Some people call them PCAs, personal care attendants, but that's just someone to help physically get someone like ready in the morning or assist in the bathroom or help them eat or take notes, etc. Interpreters, ASL interpretation, cart services are both really important and very relatively easy steps that you can take to make an event more accessible, or there's a space for other, and that's up to the discretion of the council. So for example, if you wanted to have a bus go from the National Federation of the Blind chapter to your event, that would be considered an accessibility issue. If you're a member of the National Federation of the Blind, chances are you aren't able to drive or don't want to. And accessible transportation is expensive. Lyft is expensive. So you're like, hey, we'll rent a bus and we'll drive you in. That's an accessibility issue. Organizations cannot request funds for general expenses, printing, speaker fees, staff time, meeting room rental, food, etc. So, things to note. Organizations may request up to $5,000 over a calendar year. We don't even make you pay attention to fiscal years because there are like 3 of them and it's so many. Organizations must match 50% of the funds that they request. So if they request the full $5,000, they must invest $2,500 in the event as well. And match can be staff time, it can be those general expenses, it can be registration for non-CEF consumers. And afterwards, there are requirements for federal reporting. So you must complete after event activities in order to be reimbursed, because remember, this is reimbursement based. So surveys of CEF supported individuals, full expenditure reports, list of attendees, event outcome report. Really quickly, I wanted to tell you a brief anecdote, and I think we were going to do this earlier and then everything got a little scrambled. But so Cierra mentioned the Governor's Council Conference. We are the Governor's Council for people with disabilities. However, no one on the council, not on the board is separate, but no one as staff council uses a wheelchair. Our executive director has a physical disability, but she uses a cane as her mobility device. No one on the council uses a wheelchair. We also are not ADA consultants. So before our council conference, we invited Rick Evans from the Department of Natural Resources, who is the ADA consultant there, to come and do a walk through the hotel with us. Rick is a manual wheelchair user and also an ADA certified consultant. And he went through and he said, okay, this is acceptable, this needs to be changed, this is unacceptable and definitely needs to be changed. And we discovered at the hotel that we had selected that some of the accessible rooms were not accessible for people who use power wheelchairs, because when you went into the bathroom, you could not shut the door behind you. The chair wouldn't fit and you couldn't shut the door.
But if you are an ambulatory wheelchair user and could transfer out of the chair and walk into the bathroom, it was accessible. We would not have thought of that without Rick, or without someone to come in and specifically say, hey, did you look at these things? Some of the doors were too heavy. Interior doors should use no more than 5 pounds of pressure to open. Some of the doors were too heavy. We had to have them like change the way the hinges worked and the hydraulics worked. So don't think accessibility it's not easily solved, and you're going to make mistakes. We made mistakes, and people have different accessibility needs. For example, we had a reception and the DJ turned the lights down for atmosphere. Some of our attendees are deaf or hard of hearing, and they were like, hey, can you turn the lights back up so that we can talk? So that we can like lip read, so that we can see people's hands, so that we can like know what we're doing. Like, oh, yes, of course, we can turn that back up. Then you have people who have like sound and light sensitivity. Like, okay, well, they want the lights down, they want the lights up, and people are going to have conflicting access needs. Access is hard. It's work. And programs like CEF, like organizations like the council, organizations like ADA America, they're all there to help you. If you have questions, ask us. If you have questions, reach out to ADA Indiana. If you have questions, reach out to an ADA consultant. Whatever you do, don't just give up though. So how does this relate to SVPP? I know Cierra touched on this a little bit, but disability is really common. The CDA estimates that 1 in 4 people, 26%, have a disability of some kind. Part of this is due to the aging population. You end up with mobility disabilities, you end up with like hearing loss, conditions of aging. Disability is incredibly common. It is a very human experience. It cuts across all demographic lines. If a person with a disability cannot access your service or your seminars, they're unable to benefit from those opportunities for assistance or for education. And people with disabilities are often left out of conversations that concern them, and SVPP is no exception. Increasing access is a sexual violence justice and a disability justice concern, and it moves us towards equity. So if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
I asked Skye if they could talk. Can you hear Skye talking?
I cannot. Okay, we have our accessibility statement posted on our office doors in certain buildings. Beyond using it more often for all that we do, how do you make the accessibility statement actually accessible? Put it on your website, put it in meeting notices, make sure that it is not just printed, that it's accessible through more than one medium. So if you're just putting it in paper somewhere, someone who is blind or low vision isn't going to be able to access that. But if you put it in the email, in the meeting notices, if you have it on your website, then that does increase accessibility. Okay. All right, all the other ones just say, yes, we can hear you. So if anyone has any questions about CEF or questions for Cierra, I'd be glad to answer.
Let's see. So we have, oops. I'm back. Here I am. Thank you so much, Kat,
You're welcome.
for that. And I'm sorry, I should have known this question, but did you tell everybody where to find the DD Council in their state?
It is linked in the PowerPoint.
Okay, it is linked in the PowerPoint.
And if you go
Is it in this slide here? Okay, this slide, here we go. Okay, fabulous. So I wanted all of you to have access to this resource so that we can move toward equity in our budgeting of time, space, money, and representation. And so the slides that are in your handouts tab inside the dashboard for the GoToWebinar, you can download the slides, and in the slides, all of the links are hyperlinked. So you can find the DD Council in your state. And so that's wonderful. And there are probably other opportunities as well, and we just don't really have time to go into all of them. So I just want to reiterate what Kat said about sexual violence primary prevention and the link to budgeting. So budgeting really does allow us to increase that social support and connectedness, which is so pivotal and protective from sexual violence. And so when we are talking about increasing connectedness and social support, we are talking about not only from a person to another person or a person to another organization, but we're talking about connecting people to resources, connecting people to access, connecting people to opportunities to thrive through things like protective environments, which is one of these strategies that the Stop SV technical packages argues that we need to do, is create protective environments. And I would argue in my practice that that is what we should prioritize. And because if we do not prioritize creating protective environments, we will continue to perpetuate the status quo, and that isn't getting us where we want to go. I want to revisit the poll questions and see if anything has changed, or to sort of measure your intent about what you're going to do with this information. And so if you'll bear with me, I will figure out how to make that happen. So the poll questions are going to ask you, again, about budgeting. So do you intend to include one or more budget line items dedicated to accessibility in your future programs or events? And I made it very simple. You can select yes, no, or we already do that. Thank you. And it looks like we have about 40% participation, with a great deal of people agreeing that yes, they're going to look into this. That makes me really happy. Thank you. I think it's going to do wonders for increasing diversity, which, ew, that's just such a canned statement, but I do know that a lot of people care about that, about who is in the room, who isn't in the room. And when we budget time, space, and money and representation to accessibility, the natural consequence is an increase in diversity, because people with disabilities have been marginalized from this movement. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and I'll share the results, which is a wonderful result in that most of us are going to look into this afterwards. And then final poll about accessibility statements. I'll just remind you that I pitched a policy change 2 weeks ago at ICADV, and I gave you part of what I used to make that argument. It's in your handouts dashboard area, And let's see, what did I call it? I want to draw your attention to it because I took a lot of time to do it. It's the ICADV draft accessibility statement. If you download that, you can use it if you want, get inspired by it, or, you know. Okay, so polls. We want to see, we've got about 35% of participants have answered that yes, they will develop an accessibility statement. 25% of people said they already do this, which is great. That's about 100% of the people who participated. So thank you with that. And I just want you to know that I will be following up with you in about 6 weeks to ask if you've done that. So, and if you have done it, I'm going to ask you to share, because I think what we can do with this information is create a post on the online sexual violence and primary prevention and disability justice hub that the task force has created for everybody. I believe that we are now transitioning to the resource sharing extravaganza or questions. And it looks like we don't have any more questions from people, but if you do have questions, please ask them. You can pop them in the chat box or in the question box. I'll move on to sharing resources with you. So if you have done any of our webinars in the last 3 months, you already know about some of this, but wait, there's more. So I want to share with you the wonderful resource that is the Vera Institute of Justice Center on Victimization and Safety. Does a lot of educating and resource creation for those of us who are looking to bridge the divide between rape crisis centers, or just between intervention and prevention. That is I feel like doing a whole webinar on that idea anyway. So I wanted to share with you that they do disability and disability and violence related webinars. A lot of them are intervention related, but they do have several. They're building the primary prevention side, which is wonderful. And because increasing access is one of the endeavors of the Stop SV technical package, it would be applicable in the rape prevention and education activities to be learning the intervention things from Vera Institute of Justice. If you don't know about what survivors with disabilities need, there's some great capacity for evaluation materials that are on that website for both disability services providers and rape crisis centers. They are working on increasing research, and in webinar 11 and 12, Kat is going to come back and we are going to do a webinar with the coordinator of the rape crisis centers in Indiana so that we can talk through, we'll talk through a little bit of the research that we found this year for the task force. And one of my favorite go-to pages for Vera is this one, the tip sheet series, Designing Accessible Events. Now, this page is something that I check about every 2 weeks because Vera is always adding delicious information to this website. So again, this link to this website is available in your handouts panel. I want to remind you about the Sexual Violence and Disability Justice Online Resource Hub that the Abuse Prevention Disability Task Force created to house all of the outcomes that we have produced over the last 2.5 years together. We already have I think 30 posts or something like that. There's so much good information there, and we only expect it to increase. I want to remind you that we set groundwork last year in a 5-webinar series, and that is available in our YouTube channel for you to take a look at. All of the webinars that are in the YouTube channel also have the slides and a link to the transcript that you can download. You know, I love those for so many reasons. Having a CART provider allows us not only to get direct quotes to use for promotional materials or just learning, but for meetings, it also provides you with minutes. And as a person who administers a lot of meetings, I love using the CART transcript as the meeting minutes. It's just, it skips a big step for me and adds so much to everybody who goes to the meetings. We did recently 4 other webinars in this series, and they were fantastic. The first one was about working with people who are deaf and hard of hearing. The second one was really about survivors with disabilities and navigating healing as a survivor with a disability and empowering people with disabilities to share their stories about healing and what it's like to be neurodivergent in a world that doesn't want us. The 8th webinar was about accessible organizing, and we had a lot of trouble with sound on that one. And so the transcript is going to be very pivotal when we finally are able to correct that document and get it back to you. And one of our most popular webinars that we've had is the sex and sensibility one, and that title in that slide is wrong. It's sex and sensibility. And if you click on any one of those links, you can go right to the webinar and listen to it. And we already have some of our webinars figured out for next grant year, which starts February 1st. And so in March, we are going to tell you all about the risk factors for sexual violence that we found in our literature review, and talk about what can rape crisis centers do with that information? What do we learn from it? What is our next step with that? And so if you're interested to know what other kind of risk factors there are out there for sexual violence that are not on the CDC website, that will be a good webinar for you. On April 3rd, we're going to have an open discussion with a doctor whose job it is to help disability services and advocacy agencies become more culturally competent and able to teach healthy sexuality to the people in their programs, since it's not something we do well just in general in America. And so, and when you add that word comorbidity is coming to my brain again, and I don't like that word, but when you have a lot of things going on, general sexual health information just isn't gonna cut it for you. And so we are going to talk a lot about what kind of adaptations you might need to make to your current sexual health curriculum that you might be doing in schools. We're going to talk about things like that and have some people with disabilities in that discussion too. So it's just not just people with white coats. And something that I wanted to say that is relevant to accessibility is that when you are working with people with disabilities, it is really important to have plan A, plan B, plan C, like probably all the way to R, I would say, maybe even Z. A lot of our plans this year have fallen through because we had somebody who went blind and then regained their vision and got a cornea transplant. We had a person who got a severe infection, and as a result, he had to get his leg amputated, and that is that webinar 13. Richard will be doing the webinar with us. He thinks he's going to be coming back to work like probably mid-February, maybe. So I'm really excited for all of you to hear what he has to say about doing sexual violence prevention with disability services. And so that's a little bit what we have coming up on the horizon. And I do believe that we are just about done for the day. This is our contact information. Again, this is available to you in our handouts. So this is going to tell you how to reach Kat, Skye, or me. And finally, funding for this webinar came from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Indiana State Department of Health, and they may not necessarily agree with everything that we said, but they do give us the money that we get to collaborate with each other. And do you have anything you want to add, Kat?
No.
Nope. Okay. Skye, do you have anything that you want to add? That's a no. I checked my text. Okay. We're going to let you go 5 minutes early. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us. And I will be waiting for your email. I'm really excited to do technical assistance with you on this, all of this, if you are interested. So reach out to us because the task force is full of people who can help. And that's, anyway, have a good day. Bye, everybody. Wait, if I leave the webinar, will it end? Oh, okay. People can probably still see me.